We feel like we're so divided, but what most voters want is nothing short of a new American dream. A promise once again that if you live in the United States, the sky's the limit, that upward mobility is wired into the way things work, and that in exchange for the benefits of living in our extraordinary country, its citizens will work hard, participate in their communities, and not expect to be taken care of unconditionally. They want a government that gives them a voice. They want to be part of a community of other Americans that makes them feel less lonely. They want a government that makes heroes out of the people who give more than they take, like veterans or first responders or our best teachers. They want leaders who will help them push forward into the future and return to the days when they believed that their children would have a better life than they do. And they are willing to support candidates who are committed to making that happen. That is not a statement about somebody who lives in a blue state or someone who looks in a red state. And I just wish that there were some way to turn down the heat and come back to saying, let's talk about what we all agree on.
Welcome, everyone, to 45 Forward. This is Ron Roel, your host. On today's episode, we're listening to Diane Hessen, who is an innovator, a consummate marketer, and also the author of Our Common Ground, which is a really interesting book. It's based on several years of listening to 500 of American voters across the political spectrum. And it is about a book about voting, about how people vote and why they vote the way they do. But it's also about a lot more than that. It's about our values, it's about our perspectives, how we get them, and what does unite us and divide us. It's a fascinating study. And without further ado, I want to just take you right there and meet Diane Hessen. So, Diane, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so let's, before we talk about the content of the book, let's talk about how you got there, a little bit about your background, but it's an interesting story about how you got to do this research.
I come out of the business world, and I spent most of the last 20 years or so in CEO jobs, and the biggest company I built was a tech company called Communispace, which basically had as its major product a next generation market research platform where we used the wonder of the internet to help major brands understand their consumers. So think focus group on steroids, and it was a great idea at the time because it gave brands a way to be continuously in touch with consumers whenever and wherever they needed feedback or ideas or whatever. And after we sold the company, I was running another company in the education space, and I was missing market research. But I got a call one day from a friend who I knew back from those days who had moved into the political arena, and he was a high-level strategist for Hillary Clinton. So this was back in 2015. And he called and said, the campaign has a lot of data, but he just wanted to pick my brain because they had a lot of information about what people thought and what was going on, but not a lot about why. And he wanted to see if I had any ideas. So, of course, I'm so passionate about this area. I had a zillion ideas. And at the end of the conversation, he asked if I would help them with a special project to understand one group, undecided voters in swing states. And I couldn't resist. I just thought it would be, I had never worked in politics before, and I thought it would be fascinating to try to basically walk in the shoes of voters of people as voters, as opposed to people as purchasers of consumer brands. So I moved into that. I turned things around in my life and spent several months recruiting people and actually talking to people in as many possible states as I could, all ages, all points along the political spectrum. And it was an extraordinary experience. And when the election was over, Ron, I basically figured I would take another CEO job. And I was in the middle of trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And I decided to just put a capstone on this undecided voter project. And I wrote a piece for the Boston Globe. This was in November of 2016, and it was entitled Understanding the Undecided Voters. And in that piece, I explained that my undecided voters who switched to Trump ultimately did it based on one event more than any other, and that was when Hillary Clinton said that you could put half of Trump supporters into a basket of deplorables. And I explained that at that moment, people, my voters, went crazy. They rejected the comment. They decided Hillary Clinton was too elitist for them. And they started calling themselves proud deplorables. Anyway, this op ed went viral, mostly because Jake Tapper on CNN kept talking about my research. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm making more of a difference after the election than before. So instead of taking another CEO job, I decided to set up my professional life so that I could spend at least half of my time in conversation with the electorate. And so in December of 2016, January of 2017, I recruited, instead of just undecided voters, about 500, an entirely new group of 500 voters, all states, all ages, all genders, all ethnicities, and of course, all points along the political spectrum. And I was off and running, and basically, I have been listening to and writing about and speaking about those people ever since.
Yeah. Well, what I love about this is that you said, well, you're not doing, talking to consumers about buying brands and so forth. But in fact, this perspective has informed that your approach, because as voters, that's what I love about it, because and we'll talk about your methodology and how you talk to these voters, because most people just say, all right, what's your political affiliation, who are you voting for, what are your issues, blah blah blah. Whereas you're looking at the voter as a consumer of something, of consumer of who they're voting for, and so you take a much deeper dive, so let's talk about that, and some of the major takeaways from your book. There are 3 or 4 of them, especially. I wanted to start with, one that goes to your title, which is about, having more common ground than we think. Because all we talk about today is, oh, how divided we are. Oh, we're so polarized. God, we can't talk to people at Thanksgiving and so forth. So let's talk about that first premise of, our common ground. Yeah.
And before I get into that, Ron, let me address something that you were alluding to just now, and that is kind of talking to people as consumers. So the big breakthrough when I was talking to consumers is we would talk to these consumers. So say you have a community which we did, for Colgate-Palmolive, and you had an online community of moms with little kids trying to understand how they think about dental hygiene, etc. One of the things that happened was, instead of doing a poll or doing a focus group or something one-off, if you talk to these moms every single week, over time you started building relationships with them. In traditional market research, that is a bad thing, because people say, well, if you're building relationships with these people, they're not going to be honest with you, they're going to be biased or whatever else. What we actually found at Communispace was that if you built relationships with consumers, they were significantly more likely to tell you the truth and be really, really candid about sometimes very, very sensitive topics. And the holy grail of political research is, how do you get people to tell you the truth? Think about it. I mean, you do a focus group and, there are people trying to look good in front of the focus group moderator, or, you do a poll and somebody says, I'll give you $25 to answer 5 questions. It doesn't really matter if you tell the truth. You just want your $25. So how you get people to do all of that, and I can talk about it later, but that's the way that I set this up. So not only did I get interesting information up front, but over time, people would begin to reveal themselves. And, that's what made things, so interesting. So, in terms of your question about common ground, one of the things I found, which is why the book is called Our Common Ground, is there is generally much more common ground than you would think in the United States. At least when it comes to policy. So if you ask voters about the issues, immigration, gun control, health care, infrastructure, or whatever, you can get 80% of Americans to be willing to go thumbs up on a particular solution. It doesn't mean that they necessarily love it, but they're willing to compromise. So, for instance, I did a lot of work on immigration. And even if you look at immigration right now, most Americans, I'd say it's more than 80% according to my data, most Americans agree that an illegal immigrant, someone who is undocumented, who is a criminal, should exit the United States as soon as possible. Pick them up in the dark of night, throw them in a dark truck, drive across the border to wherever else, but if they are criminal, they should be gone. Most Americans also believe that if you are if you are an undocumented immigrant in the United States, but you've been here for a while and you've raised a family and you have a job and you're paying taxes and you're rooted in and giving back to your community, that there should be some path to citizenship. So the controversy is only in the middle, which is what if you're undocumented and you're not criminal, but you're getting all kinds of free services thrown at you? And I think that's where things get gray. But in general, there is so much common ground on all of these issues. These bills don't pass, even though there is a lot of common ground, because sometimes our elected leaders are better off with no resolution. So it's much easier to be a Republican in Congress and scream and yell that immigrants are pouring into our country, and if they elect you, you'll stop them, or to be a Democrat and make the case for immigration and compassion. And, this was especially taking place way back when people saw children being put in cages and everything. So the idea of resolving the issue takes the talking points away. So we perceive that we agree on nothing, when in fact, if you take a deep breath and talk to people about any of the key issues going on in our country, it's amazing how much people agree with the ultimate solution. Sometimes we disagree with how to actually accomplish it.
Right. Yeah. So this, coming from my perspective in the news media, it's sadly, I think we exacerbate these issues. So you're absolutely right. From a political perspective, having the talking points, having these divides gives you talking points. And I think there was a lot of concern that on both sides, they didn't want resolution before the election because, and wait a minute, that gives away the talking points. That said, the media in general, and again, this is a generalization, divisiveness makes a better narrative. So it's a tendency to do that, to emphasize the conflict. And I think people, when they talk about the news media, emphasizing the negative, well, I don't think it's necessarily negative, but they emphasize the differences. So if you have a story and you say, well, what's the difference between these two positions? These two people may agree on 9 things and disagree on the 10th, and the coverage will be about the 10th. Focus on all of that. So I get it, but it doesn't help in terms of recognizing it does tend to, I think, sometimes polarize more.
Yes. And I do think, I mean, look, you're a media person, so you know this better than I do. But the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads, is definitely true. And so I think not necessarily negative, but very radical things going on in our country, whether it's far left or far right, are much more likely to get airtime than something that's just in the center. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm embarrassed to say that I listen to my news every night at 6:30, or else I tape it. And in the last 5 minutes of my news show, they say, and there's good news tonight. And most of the time, I'm done. I turn the TV off. So I think we're all so conditioned to hear about the crazy, radical things going on in the country. And the problem with that is because of all those extremes, we have perceptions of the other side that are really inaccurate.
That's the other thing I want to talk about. Talking about the other. That's another. Yeah. So let's go into that.
Okay. So, look, think about it. If you ask most Republicans, I'll do both sides of it. If you ask most Republicans about the Democratic Party, they will say Democrats are a bunch of elitist socialists who want to take my hard earned tax dollars and give them away to illegal immigrants, criminals, and people who are just too lazy to work and who want to take away my guns and allow women to use abortions as birth control and who want to completely dismantle policing or whatever. And they also believe just in this woke ideology that equality of outcome is more important than equality of opportunity, which is going to destroy our country. That's what they say. Actually, that's what they say on a good day. I could give you some quotes from my voters that are just unbelievable. Now, the opposite is true. If you ask most Democrats about Republicans, and especially those who really support Trump, they will say that they are a bunch of hypocritical, uneducated deplorables who love with their guns, who sleep with their guns, who refused to wear masks during COVID, who deny that climate change is happening, who are okay with the downfall of our democracy, who think that no matter what happened in the Epstein files, it's absolutely fine because he's their guy, and who never met a black person that they liked. Or more recently, they're okay with a president who's been charged with criminal activity and who plans to persecute everyone who's heard him if elected. Both of these are wrong. That's not how those sides feel. But these stereotypes dominate our perspectives. And I'd say that most of the time, what I've described are on the very, very fringes of each party. And most other people are, they're not crazy radicals. They're just, they care about their families. They're trying to get by, pay the bills, stay healthy, etc. And, where they live and how they live and how they grew up very much influences how they think about ways to solve their problems.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think that we underestimate the influence of local culture, meaning the family, the friends, the community, how much it shapes their views. And sometimes one of the things that's sort of related to the thing we were just talking about is another notion of yours of we don't vote for things. We sometimes do, but we tend to vote against the other.
Yes. Yeah. So I used to say this about 2016, but I actually think it's 2016, 2020, and 2024, according to my data. People were not voting for their candidate because they loved the candidate or thought he was a great guy or a great woman. They just hated the other side. So it's interesting. I used to ask people in 2016, 17, 18, like, why did you vote for Donald Trump? And the most frequent answer by far was, well, I didn't really love Trump, but I hated Hillary Clinton. Many people thought that Hillary Clinton, it was, they thought she was totally corrupt. They would state this entire lifetime of questionable activities. Whitewater, Vince Foster, the Clinton Foundation, Benghazi, stealing furniture from the White House, blah, blah. I could go on and on and on and on. And the dislike of the alternative continued. So even in the most recent election last year, lots of people who were voting for Trump were voting against Biden, against Harris, not happy with the way things had been going in their lives and in the country. The last time that I think people actually said, I'm voting for a candidate, You could go way back to 2008 when people voted for Obama because they felt some kind of inspiration in Obama's first term. But there's so much of, I don't really love this guy as much as you think I do. I don't really love this woman as much as you think I do. I'm just, many Democrats in 2024 voted against Trump, and many Republicans were largely voting against Harris.
Yeah. It does seem to be a phenomenon, and again, I'm just sort of generalizing, but I think in many cases, it is easier for people to be against something than for something. For something requires, well, where does this take me? Where against it's just, I don't want that, And I go back even to my relative youth when I was in college, and that was the time of the Vietnam War, and what was the sentiment was against the war. We were anti-war, okay. And then when I left college, the war ended, and then there was a period in my university that was characterized by what was called eerie tranquility, which is like, okay, well, now what? Okay, so the opposition, what you're opposed to is, but now what? How do you go forward? That's a lot. That's a lot harder.
I started college in 1972, and I remember feeling really disappointed because most of the protests were over. And I was ready to go in and, scream and yell and carry signs and everything. And there was no opportunity to do that anymore. I had been looking forward to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it is harder to just be against something. You can just because you can rail and rant, and it takes some real thought, some real discernment. Like, okay, well, now what do I do about it? Now that this is over, how do we move forward? So that's always harder. But we'll get to that a little bit more. But you know what? I think I'm going to take. This is a good point to just take a quick break, Diane. So, folks, we're going to take a very short break. When we come back, we'll be talking much more with Diane Hessen, the author of Our Common Ground. So don't go anywhere.
Are you caring for an aging loved one? It can feel overwhelming, but you don't have to do it alone. Ron's book, The Caregiving Navigator, is a step-by-step guide designed to help you plan, prepare, and provide compassionate care with confidence. From organizing family conversations to navigating long-term care and finding support for yourself, the caregiver, it's all here. Find the Caregiving Navigator now on Amazon and take the first step toward peace of mind.
Welcome back, folks, to 45 Forward. We're talking today with Diane Hessen, the author of Common Ground. Before the break, we were talking a lot about how people tend to vote against things rather than for things, and some of her other takeaways from her work. Now I wanted to just pivot a little bit and talk about a little bit more, take a deeper dive about how she listens to people, because this is something that I think, to me, really made a significant difference about the quality of information she got and how she does it, and frankly, I think makes it really is a treatment of people in a way that I don't personally get a feeling from most posters. But like, what do you think? Where you go? Without much context. So to talk about, we started talking earlier about your building relationships. So let's talk a little bit more of that, about how that, the relationships and your term active listening.
I actually first got really interested in listening much earlier in my career, before I was even in market research, when I was in sales. And one of the things that I noticed is I had a coworker who was on the sales team with me, and he was a real introvert, very quiet. We'd all go out partying and everything, and he wasn't really that interested in coming. Just a very good guy, but very quiet. And at the end of my first year in sales, he sold more than anyone else in the sales force. He got Salesperson of the Year. And I started thinking about that a lot. Why is it? And by the way, I became a sales manager. I stayed in sales for a really long time. And I even noticed this when I was running companies, when I was hiring people. Because one of the ways that you tell whether you have a good sales call is who has most of the airtime. And if you, the salesperson, are yak, 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 and the customer's just sitting there, it's definitely not as successful a call as when the customer is doing all the talking. So, one of the ways that I got to be successful in sales is I learned instead of being promotional and enthusiastic, I became curious. This whole notion of learning how to listen really well and get people to talk applies to in so many fields. It's great for leadership. It's great for your personal relationships with your spouse. It's great for how I talk to my grandchildren, and it was certainly great for how I was able to talk to voters, and especially when I felt that people were telling me things that I just thought were crazy. And the three words, you know, you don't have to take a course on listening, but the three words that are the best listening words I know are tell me more. And what I'd say to your listeners is if there's nothing else that you take away from this and you want to try to understand what's going on for someone, whether you're trying to understand why they voted for the person that they did, or whether they're trying to understand in a very difficult situation, just taking a breath, and instead of the person talking and then you giving them advice, or instead of the person talking and you saying, well, that's really interesting, this is how I feel, or instead of the person talking and you interrogating them with lots of other questions like, well, where did you get your information? And what do you see on the internet? And did you see that? And did you see that? Just say, that's really interesting. Tell me more. And the first time you do it, you think, oh gosh, they're just going to say, what do you mean? Are you trying to like process me? But people always tell you more. You know, just using words, we use the skill is called encouraging, but it's just, oh, well, you know, that's interesting. Nodding your head. Tell me more. Well, where did you get that? Why do you feel that way? Oh, that's good. So where, you know, tell me more about that. Let me just keep digging into that. And almost every time you do that, you learn things that stun you about the assumptions that you had made before you started, you know, to really try to walk in the other person's shoes.
Yeah, yeah. And you talk about listening and like listening without an agenda, saying like without trying to change their mind or shape their opinion.
One of the reasons that, you know, that is where being a researcher was helpful to me. So I'll just come clean here. I always try to be nonpartisan. I tried to be as nonpartisan as possible in the book, but I admitted that I did some work for the Clinton campaign. So when I first started the major phase of my research, where I had this new panel of 500 people, like I literally couldn't understand how somebody could walk into the voting booth and vote for Donald Trump. And over the years, I found out a lot about how they could do that. And I remember once, I'm like 2 years into this research, one of my voters who was a moderate, like an independent voter from Florida, sends me an email and says, would you be willing to have a phone conversation? And I said, sure. And I pick up the phone and I call her, hi, what's up? And she says, look, I haven't been totally truthful with you. I told you in the beginning that I voted for Hillary Clinton. And I actually voted for Donald Trump. And I think I'm messing up your data. Okay, so first of all, what was my reaction? My reaction as a researcher was, oh my gosh, this is a great moment because I've got somebody that trusts me enough. And then she starts saying, however, you've got to really keep this confidential because if my husband finds out, he will leave me. If my children find out, they will disown me. I mean, you know, da da da. But she told me, and then I said, that's so interesting. So it's okay. My data's fine. I got 500 voters, but like, tell me why. Why were you afraid to tell me? What's going on in your neighborhood? You know, all of that. And then, so for me, it was a victory that she told me all of this and was willing to be as honest as possible. That's what happens when you're a researcher. You just want to know where people are coming from.
Well, it's that word curiosity. And I think that what that does is it you know, well, first of all, by spending time with people, you know, you're building trust in a relationship, and they trust you, and they're trusting that you're not just trying to, you know, shape them or point them in some direction or just get something out of them. And so I think that's really important, that building up that trust, people are willing to tell you something because they know you. It's sort of you care about them. You care what they really think.
I do care. I really, really care what they think. In fact, it's funny. I'm still doing this research, so I'm still going out to everybody, mostly online, every Tuesday, and asking them questions. And I try to get as creative as possible, so I'm not boring people to death. But in 2022, I just thought, I don't think there's a lot that I don't know. I've been talking to these people for so long, so I stopped the project. I said goodbye to everybody. And at the other end, I all of a sudden got curious again. So I did a restart and everybody came back. But when I stopped the project, people would say things to me like, I am so sad about this, Diane. Are you sure you want to do this? Because you're the only person who listens to me. My spouse doesn't listen to me. My boss doesn't listen to me. My kids don't listen to me. But I feel like when I'm telling you something, it really matters or whatever, which was such an enormous compliment. But for me, that's the dynamic that you have to get you have to build that kind of trust if you really want to be able to confidently say to people, here's what's happening in our country, here's what's happening with voters.
And you're doing it because you want to know what they think. You really want to know how they feel about things. I had several weeks ago. I had a man on my show named Jack York who he worked for one of his projects it was dealing with talking with seniors about what they thought, what their stories were, and so he had this. He went around and he was talking to centenarians around the country, and he basically would pick them up from their assisted living facility or wherever they were, and they'd sit in his car with him and he would talk with them. He'd just talk. And like you, he would say, well, these people tell me these most amazing things. But it was the same premise that, first of all, no one asked them what they thought. They know they have these stories, but no one asked them to tell their stories or what they.
Yeah, and I think people are used to being asked what they think. But then you say, well, what I think, let me make up something contemporary today. What I think is um, we have a war between Ukraine and Russia, and what I think is that I'm confident that Trump will end this war within the next week. And then if you don't agree with that, you're like rolling your eyes going, oh, right. And you're done, right? So people offer their opinions, but it's got to be curiosity about what they're saying and where they come from. Like the punchline on that is about 98% of my voters, so all but a few, think that Vladimir Putin is a bad dude, right? This includes the large proportion of my Trump supporters. Now, where we're not in agreement is what do you do about that? So a lot of people who are Trump supporters believe that you have to keep, that the best strategy is to keep your enemies close. And people are able to be very articulate about that. And then there are other people saying the best strategy when someone's a bad dude is to alienate them, get away from them, and not invite them to Alaska, etc. So I think just trying to understand any of those positions, matters a lot. But the common ground is everybody thinks everybody thinks the guy's a gangster.
So let me just, in our last segment here, I want to talk a little bit more about generational issues, because you were talking about listening, and one of the things that I find interesting is that if you talk to a lot of older people, what do they feel? They feel that they're invisible. No one listens to them anymore. And I think that's true a lot of younger people too. People in their 20s feel the same way. And so we talk about an epidemic of loneliness. And to me, it's almost an epidemic of people not listening to each other, as you point out. So, and I'm sure people do ask you a lot about, well, what are the differences generationally in terms of older versus younger voters? So let's talk about that and kind of explode some of the stereotypes there.
Sure. I I don't find major differences between old people and young people when it comes to what they really care about. um, I think, when I look at their data, a lot of young people, the number one influence on how they vote is their parents, uh, how they were raised and where they grew up and all of those things. I think the difference is that young people tend to be more extreme. They have a tendency to just kind of see things more in black and white. They've lived with things mostly in black and white, right? You get a grade, you pass, fail. You go to a good school, you don't go to a good school. You get a job, you don't get a job. So for them, the idea of, good versus bad, that's a good idea, that's a bad idea. And we all know this, right? We know that when you're young, you can afford to, run to the streets and protest and all of those things. And after a while, so I think as people age, I experience them getting more and more moderate. Not everyone, but I think for my voters, as the older they are, the more that they speak to me in nuance, or um, they'll say things like, "I." One of my Trump supporters, who's voted for Trump both times, said to me the other day, because I did a project with them where I said, are you a MAGA voter? I wanted to understand how they thought about MAGA. If somebody said to me, well, I don't really call myself MAGA because um, I think it's more nuanced than that. MAGA to me feels very black and white. You either support him or you don't, or whatever else. That kind of sentiment is more likely to come from someone who is older. Um, what I've seen a lot, and I haven't done this for about a year, but I did find that younger people were significantly less likely to vote. Um, that if they looked at all of the tools that they had in terms of, in terms of just supporting our democracy and being an American citizen, they were more likely to be interested in maybe giving money to a candidate or knocking on doors for a candidate or using other types of political power like protest. They don't necessarily feel that their vote counts. Now, some of that is, states now are so extreme, dark red or dark blue. So, I'm in Massachusetts right now. If you live in Massachusetts and you're voting in a presidential election, you feel like your vote doesn't matter, right? Um, and so young people are way more likely to say, I was going to vote, but I got really busy at work and it doesn't matter to begin with, which is not really healthy for our society. But of course, if you push people and they say, I didn't vote, instead of saying, oh my gosh, you have to vote. I mean, everybody has to vote. Here's why voting is important. Well, what happened? Why didn't you vote? And what's the thought process that, led you there? So, but I don't find it's a radical difference.
Well, that's interesting too, because again, I think we're driven by stereotypes. So you think, well, as you get older, you tend to get more set in your ways, and get, again, it's that stereotype of the older, crotchety old man, kind of. But I think you're absolutely right. I think you do become you have more experience in life. You see things, different perspectives that you didn't have when you were younger. You just didn't have those experiences. And I think also, I guess older people forget about being younger, and they have stereotypes of younger people, in terms of their views.
I'll tell you where I did find one of my favorite stories, and I don't know why I didn't put this in the book, but there's people who are doing political strategy. Very often you'll hear this all the time. Well, uneducated voters, vote for Trump, and people who are more educated, vote for the Democratic candidate or whatever. And you hear that educated, uneducated thing, which sometimes gives me the creep. It feels a little insulting, right? People who are college educated or, this way, and the implication is, you're kind of dumb, right? You're not educated if you are, actually voting. You're voting for the wrong person that way. I had, yeah, I had a voter named Beth, who was a female Democrat from Arizona, and she had a fascinating background. So she grew up in Northwest Idaho, in the middle of nowhere, Ron, in a community that had not only had no people of color, but I remember once she said to me, they had no brunettes. So she grew up with a huge fear of and lack of understanding of people who were different. So she ends up being a great student, and she got a scholarship to Boise State University. And she went, and it was absolutely eye opening. Like, she told me how exciting it was to get onto that campus and see every color. And she said there were people from 35 countries, and it just widened her aperture and broadened her perspective on the world. And that's what she got from going to college. And the funny thing is, she started dating a guy. Of course, it's just like a TV show. She started dating a guy who was Lebanese. She took him home for Christmas, and her parents were not happy. And after a long conversation of it's either him or us, she left home at Christmas time, and she eventually married this guy, and they moved to Phoenix. But the story demonstrated to me that college is not really about so much, it's not really about the intellectual knowledge that you get, but Boise State changed the way Beth views the world. So Beth now sees America's best interests as inextricably interconnected with other countries. If you go to Boise State and you see all those different people, it starts to hit you. We breathe the same air. We contracted the same virus. We use the same internet. Our trade is mutually beneficial, etc. And you start to build a perspective on the world, which may or may not be right, may or may not be the dominating perspective you have, but it tends to be a view that internationalists have, who right now tend to be Democrats. So sometimes when you say people who are more educated vote this way, it's great to keep in the back of your mind that it's not about is the person smart or not, it's just how much have they learned. And I remember, I'll tell you one more story. I had a voter in Pennsylvania, and we were talking about all of this, like, kind of lack of real interest in foreign policy on the part of a whole bunch of voters. And I said to him, "Oh, that's crazy. Like, they always say, can you find Ukraine on a map, right? If you can't find Ukraine on a map, maybe you shouldn't be going to the voting booth, or." And he said to me that he had a cousin who grew up right near him, and the cousin got into, I think it was Westchester State College in the Philadelphia area. Oh no, Bloomsburg State College. So it was about a 3-hour drive from where his cousin went to school. He's the first kid in his family ever to go to college. So they pack up the car, and they had a relative who lived about 90 minutes away. They drove west, and they stopped 90 minutes into the trip to, like, break up the trip on the way to this very long 3-hour journey to Bloomsburg State College. So he talked about how radical that was, how unusual that was to go so far away from home. And then he said, do you think that this family knows where Ukraine is? Right? I mean, Bloomsburg State was another country for them. So I think it's all about what you know and what your life is like and where you can afford to kind of go and take your family and everything else. And all of those factors are part of the narrative.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying that I'm picking up is that you need to find a way to expand the common ground in some ways, and that I think the what emerged as sort of the elitist aspect of going to college and looking down at people who didn't go to college, I think is really unfortunate because when I went to college, I was looking forward to a liberal arts education. I was looking forward to learning about stuff I knew nothing about, and in some cases was sobering. It was like, oh my God, I'm terrible at that. I took courses in sculpture and, and drawing, and I was like, I was at the back of the class. But I was good, but I couldn't compete. But that's what it was about. And I remember when I filled out my freshman application, they said, "Do you have any preferences?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." I said, "I don't want to room with anyone from New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut, because I learn about people from other parts of the country." And in one of my years there, I was interested in diversity. You have to be curious about it, but I was interested in. And I was at Yale, and so we all a lot of people, Ivy League, yes, but in terms of the backgrounds of people there, one year I had a suite of roommates, and we did very different interests. But when I looked around, I said, well, one of the things that's interesting is the diversity of religion in this group of us. And so we had a Protestant, we had a Catholic, we had an Orthodox Jew, we had sort of a moderate Jew, we had a Mormon, and a Quaker. And of course there's but that kind of, you have to have that common ground where you can really be with people and room with people and have dinner with people to really understand their experiences.
And I bet your listeners are thinking about this now, because I know, like, my grandchildren. Do you know now when they pick roommates? Like, if they went to high school, like, if we're in the same high school class and you got into Yale and I got into Yale, we are highly likely to be rooming together. Like, the kids ask to be roommates with their friends and with people who they know, which is such a miss.
Well, this has been a great show. I just want to give you an opportunity. Any sort of closing thoughts, or have you been learning in the most recent iteration of your research anything different from what you originally found in your book?
There's one theme that I think has been consistent for a long time, and that is that we feel like we're so divided, but what most voters want, Ron, is nothing short of a new American dream. A promise, once again, that if you live in the United States, the sky's the limit, that upward mobility is wired into the way things work, and that in exchange for the benefits of living in our extraordinary country, its citizens will work hard, participate in their communities, and not expect to be taken care of unconditionally. They want a government that gives them a voice. They want to be part of a community of other Americans that makes them feel less lonely, which is what's going on now. They want a government that makes heroes out of the people who give more than they take, like veterans or first responders or our best teachers. They want leaders who will help them push forward into the future and return to the days when they believed that their children would have a better life than they do. And they are willing to support candidates who are committed to making that happen. That is not a statement about somebody who lives in a blue state or someone who looks in a red state. And I just wish that there were some way to turn down the heat and come back to saying, let's talk about what we all agree on.
Wow. Well, the first step is to read your book. Buy your book, read it. Yes. And speaking of which, how can people get in touch and learn more about your work and your website and any events that you, or any webinars and so forth?
Yeah, the book is at ourcommongroundbook.com, or you can just go to dianehessen.com and, kind of navigate your way around that. You can read the book. You can be really, really masochistic and listen to the audiobook, which I have all these friends who listen, who do audiobooks and everything now. And I say, oh my gosh, that's love, like listening to me for 14 hours, or whatever else. The book is a couple of years old, but I think that a lot of the book, the sales were really, really good, and then things dropped off, and now it's going like this again, because I think people are saying, oh my gosh, like, how do I think about, what's happening in the world now? So, that's the easiest way to do it, but whether you read the book or not, the more that we can get a critical mass of people to just take a deep breath and say, let me just try, at least let me start with my family. Let me start with the people who really, really matter to me. Let me just take one more swing at this, right? Most of the people right now, for instance, who are enthusiastic about Donald Trump are enthusiastic for two reasons. One is they think the chaos in the southern border has stopped. The stock market is doing well. There are increased number of companies that are investing in and building plants in the U.S. They're getting rid of unnecessary regulations. They're making efforts to reduce the size of the government, etc. And they are willing to put up with some of the stuff that they hate that Trump is doing, or that they hate that is happening in the country, because some of the things they really care about related to just their pocketbook and their own dreams for their family are at least coming through. And talking about the other, they feel that it is better than what it would have been like were the alternative in power. That doesn't mean you have to agree, but there's so much in there, to talk to people about. Of course, I can do the flip side also, but, within that is, when I do that, I'm nodding my head a lot about, what makes people willing to put up with stuff that they don't like, in support of something else.
I think in addition, we do have to find venues to get people together. I mean, I know this group called Braver Angels, which, that their whole focus is basically putting together events and meetings and, where what they do to, they do break it into red and blue, alums of reds and blues together and sitting down and talk and so forth. So there are ways to do it, yeah.
Definitely. And look, I'm hoping for a candidate. I don't really care whether they're Republican or Democrat, but I'm hoping for a younger, very charismatic, very smart candidate who really has some different ideas about how to bring people together, and about how to how to get rid of people's perception that the American dream is dead, and to have new ideas and all of that. And I think that if there's a way to do that in a positive way, that's the best way to stop the divisiveness. It's just, I'm waiting for the person to appear.
Well, me too. But for now, we're at the end of our show. I could keep talking for another hour with you, but I want to thank you for a terrific, thought-provoking conversation. And again, if people if they have questions or comments, is the best way to just go to your website, or what's the best way to contact you?
They can also just email me. Just, sometimes that takes a little longer, but my email is just exactly what you would bet. It's dhessen@gmail.com.
So once again, folks, this is Ron Rowell, 45 Forward. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you want to see a full archive of my shows or see what's coming up next, just go to 45forward.org. And if you have comments or questions, just email me at ron@45forward.org. So, and you can sign up for my monthly newsletter as well by going there. So thanks once again, Diane. Been a real pleasure. And folks, until next week, keep moving forward, 45 forward.